The sun had long disappeared behind the Arizona hills, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gray. The wind howled across the open plains, carrying with it the smell of dust and rain. Thomas Hale, a poor farmer in his early 40s, stood outside his small wooden cabin, pulling his worn coat tighter around him. He could feel the storm coming. His crops had already suffered from weeks of cold wind, and if the storm got worse, he might lose what little he had left. Still, he didn't think of himself. He only thought of his few animals and the fragile roof that covered his home. Thomas lived alone. His wife had passed years ago, and he never had children. The neighbors, scattered miles apart, knew him as a quiet man with kind eyes. Though poor, he was known to share what he had. Many travelers had found shelter in his barn, or a warm bowl of soup in his kitchen when they had nowhere else to go. Life had hardened him, but it had not taken away his heart. That evening, as the wind began to roar, Thomas went out to check his fence. The snow had started falling thick and heavy, and the world was turning white fast. He pushed through the cold, his boots sinking into the growing snow. As he reached the edge of his land, he noticed something strange: footprints. They were fresh, large, and deep. He stopped and bent down to look closely. These weren't ordinary footprints. They were far bigger than any man's he had ever seen. His first thought was fear. Could it be a bear? But the shape was human. Curiosity took over. Thomas followed the tracks across the frozen field until he saw a dark shape lying near a cluster of rocks. His heart jumped. He ran closer, brushing off the snow that had covered the figure. It was a young woman, tall and strong, her skin tanned and her dark hair tangled with frost. Her hands were tied with a rough rope and she was barely breathing. Thomas could see that she had been through something terrible. For a moment he just stood there, unsure of what to do. Taking her in could mean trouble, big trouble. The settlers feared the Apache, and this woman clearly belonged to them. If anyone found her in his home, they might accuse him of treason or worse. But as the wind whipped against his face, Thomas looked at her again. She was alive, but she wouldn't be for long in this cold. He couldn't walk away. Whatever danger waited, he couldn't let another person die out here. Without another thought, he lifted her into his arms. She was tall and heavy, yet he carried her slowly, one step at a time, back toward the cabin. His muscles ached, but his mind was clear. He had to save her. When he reached his cabin, he laid her gently near the fire. The room was dim and small, smelling of wood smoke and old bread. He cut the ropes from her wrists and rubbed her hands to bring warmth back into them. Her skin was cold as ice. He fetched a blanket, wrapped her up, and boiled water for tea. As the storm raged outside, he stayed beside her, checking her breathing every few minutes. Hours passed. The wind howled louder and the night grew long. At dawn, a weak ray of sunlight slipped through the window. The storm had calmed. Thomas sat half asleep in his chair when he heard a soft sound, a cough. His eyes opened. The girl's lips moved. She opened her eyes slowly, confusion flashing across her face. When she saw him, she tried to move away, but her strength failed. Her eyes were sharp but full of fear. Thomas raised his hands gently and said, "It's all right. You're safe here." She didn't understand every word, but she could see his calmness. He handed her the warm tea, and after a long pause, she took it. She spoke in broken English. Her name was Nyola. She was from a distant Apache camp. She had been captured by men who traded people for goods. But she had escaped during the storm. Thomas listened quietly, anger and sadness in his heart. He didn't know much about her people, but he knew suffering when he saw it. He gave her food and a place to rest. For the next few days she hardly spoke, but she helped him with small tasks, feeding the animals, mending ropes, and carrying firewood. Thomas couldn't help but notice her strength. She was taller than most men and could lift a bale of hay like it weighed nothing. Yet despite her size, there was gentleness in the way she moved. Slowly, a quiet bond formed between them. He respected her courage, and she respected his kindness. She had grown up in a world that saw men like him as enemies, and he had lived among people who feared her kind. But inside that small cabin, those walls began to fade. Sometimes Thomas would find her staring out the window toward the mountains, whispering words in her own language. He didn't ask what they meant. He just knew she longed to go home. As days turned into a week, whispers began to spread. A ranch hand from a nearby farm claimed he saw a giant Indian woman working near Thomas Hale's field. Soon men started talking. They rode by his land, pretending to check fences, their eyes always searching. One night, a group of them stopped by his gate. Their leader, a broad man with a thick beard, called out, "Hail, we heard you've been keeping one of them. You'd better not be hiding what don't belong here." Thomas stepped out, his heart pounding. "You've heard wrong," he said quietly, but his voice was firm. The men exchanged glances. "If she's here, it'll bring trouble to all of us," one warned. Thomas stood his ground. "There's no trouble here," he replied. After a tense silence, they turned their horses and left. But he knew they'd be back. That night, he told Nayola that people had started asking questions. She looked at him with calm eyes and said, "They hate my people. You help me, they hate you too." Thomas smiled sadly. "Maybe, but doing right's never been easy." She didn't answer, but the look she gave him said more than words ever could. 3 days later, before sunrise, Thomas heard a faint sound from outside, a rhythmic beat like drums. His dog started barking wildly. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside. What he saw froze him in place. Across the ridge, a line of riders appeared, their silhouettes dark against the pink morning sky. They moved silently but with power. Their horses were painted, and the men carried bows and spears. At the front rode a tall man with a headdress of feathers, his face solemn and proud. Nayola came out beside him. When she saw them, her expression changed. Her lips trembled. "My people," she whispered. Thomas didn't move. He knew this was her family, her tribe, but he also knew what that might mean for him. The leader dismounted, walking slowly toward the cabin. His eyes met Thomas's, sharp and unreadable. The other warriors waited behind him. Nayola stepped forward, bowing her head slightly. The tall man placed his hand on her shoulder, speaking to her in Apache. Then his gaze shifted to Thomas. Thomas stood still, the cold wind brushing against his face. He didn't know what the man would do, thank him or punish him. The silence between them felt endless. Finally, the tall man spoke a few words in English, his voice deep and controlled. "You save her? Why?" Thomas swallowed hard and answered, "Because she needed help." The man's face gave nothing away. He looked at his daughter again, then at the small cabin behind them. The sun rose slowly over the hills, casting golden light across the land. The Apache warriors stood like statues. The air was heavy with tension, and Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Whatever happened next would decide everything. Nayola's eyes were filled with emotion. The man before them was her father, Chief Tahoma, one of the most respected leaders of her people. He had come for his daughter, but he would also have to decide the fate of the man who had dared to save her. And in that quiet moment, when the wind stopped and the world seemed to hold its breath, Thomas Hale realized that the hardest part was yet to come. The air around the small cabin grew still. The only sounds were the wind brushing through dry grass and the soft steps of the Apache warriors as they surrounded the farm. Thomas stood motionless, his hands trembling slightly, but his eyes stayed calm. He knew he had no chance against them if they meant harm, yet he didn't regret what he had done. The girl he had saved stood beside him, her tall figure strong and proud despite the fear in her heart. She looked from her father to the farmer, caught between two worlds that had never trusted each other. Chief Tahoma's sharp gaze studied Thomas from head to toe. His face carried the lines of wisdom in battle, and his eyes told stories of loss and pride. For a long moment, no one spoke. The warriors waited for their leader's command, their hands resting on their spears. Thomas could feel his heart beating like a drum in his chest. He didn't know if they had come to thank him or to take revenge for interfering with their people. Finally, the chief stepped forward. He spoke a few words in Apache, and Nayola translated softly. "My father asks why you helped me when your people hate mine." Thomas took a slow breath and said, "Because I saw someone who needed help. That's reason enough." Nayola looked at her father as she repeated the words. The chief remained silent for a while, looking deeply into Thomas's eyes as if trying to see the truth behind them. After a long pause, Chief Tahoma nodded slightly. He turned to his men and spoke quickly in Apache. The warriors lowered their weapons. Thomas didn't understand the language, but he could feel the tension slowly fading. Nayola's face softened with relief. She said quietly, "My father believes you speak truth." Then something unexpected happened. The chief placed his hand on his chest, a gesture of respect, and said a few words in his native tongue. Nayola translated again, her voice trembling. "He says you saved the life of his daughter. You have done what few men would dare. For that he gives you honor." Thomas didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, unsure how to respond to such dignity. The chief then looked around the small cabin and at the poor land that stretched beyond it. He saw the broken fences, the thin cattle, and the man's rough, calloused hands. It was clear that this farmer lived a life of hardship. Yet even in his struggle he had chosen kindness. That thought stayed with the chief longer than he showed. One of the warriors brought a leather pouch to the chief. He opened it and took out a small silver medallion carved with tribal symbols. It was an emblem of trust rarely given to outsiders. The chief walked toward Thomas and placed it gently in his hand. "You saved her," he said in broken English. "Now, she and our people will remember you." Thomas looked down at the medallion, realizing it was not just a gift, it was a promise. But before Thomas could thank him, the chief continued speaking to Nayola in Apache. She listened, her eyes wide with surprise. When she turned to Thomas, her voice was soft. "My father says something more," he says. "Because you saved me, my life belongs to you now. It is our way." Thomas was taken aback. "No," he said quickly. "You owe me nothing. I did it because it was right." Nayola told her father what he said, and the chief's expression changed to one of quiet respect. He replied, "Then you are a man of true heart." The warriors prepared to leave, but before they did, the chief said one final thing to Thomas. "You are not our enemy. If ever danger comes to you, call our name and the wind will carry it." It sounded like a legend, but Thomas could feel the sincerity in the chief's tone. He bowed his head in silent gratitude. Nayola looked torn. She wanted to return with her people, yet she also felt a deep bond with the man who had saved her life. She stepped closer to Thomas and said, "You gave me kindness when no one else would. I will never forget." Her father called her and she walked toward him, her tall figure casting a long shadow in the morning light. As the Apache riders disappeared into the distance, Thomas stood watching until they were only specks on the horizon. The valley was quiet again, but something inside him had changed forever. Days turned into weeks. The story of what had happened spread through the nearby towns, though no one believed it completely. Some said Thomas had made peace with the Apache, while others whispered that he had struck some secret deal. But Thomas paid no attention to rumors. He returned to his daily work, planting, feeding his animals, and fixing his fences. Yet from time to time he would find signs that reminded him he was not forgotten. A basket of fresh fruit left near his gate. A repaired section of fence that he hadn't mended himself. Once he found a beautiful woven blanket folded neatly on his porch. He never saw who left them, but he knew. The Apache were keeping their silent promise. One summer morning, as the sun rose over the dry hills, Thomas heard the soft rhythm of hooves. When he stepped outside, Nayola was there, sitting tall on her horse. She looked stronger than ever, wearing traditional beads and feathers that shimmered in the light. She smiled at him and said, "My father sent me to see if you are well." Thomas laughed softly. "I'm doing fine thanks to some unexpected friends." She dismounted and helped him in the fields for a while. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable. When she left, she said, "Our people remember what you did. If anyone tries to harm you, they will answer to us." Thomas smiled and said, "I hope it never comes to that." Years passed. Seasons changed. The land grew kinder, and the farm began to prosper. Some said it was luck. Others said it was the protection of unseen guardians. But Thomas knew it was a blessing born from a single act of kindness. He never forgot the stormy night when he had found Nayola lying half frozen in the snow. That moment had not only saved her, it had changed him. When Thomas grew old, travelers often stopped by his land to rest or ask for water. Some noticed the strange silver medallion that hung by his door and asked where it came from. He would smile and tell them a story of a winter night, a lost girl, and a friendship that defied fear and hatred. The younger men didn't always believe him, but they listened, captivated by the warmth in his voice. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sit on his porch, watching the mountains in the distance. Sometimes he thought he saw riders on the ridge outlined against the sunset. He would smile and whisper, "I hope you're safe." Nayola. He knew she was out there somewhere, leading her people with the same strength and grace he had seen in her long ago. The story of Thomas Hale and Nayola became a local legend. Some said it was a tale of courage, others said it was proof that kindness had the power to bridge even the widest gap. But for those who knew the truth, it was more than that. It was a reminder that humanity, when shown with a pure heart, could melt even the hardest barriers between worlds. Long after Thomas was gone, people still spoke of the poor farmer who once saved a giant Apache girl. They said her tribe never forgot the man who risked everything for one act of compassion. Some nights, when the wind blew across the valley, old folks would whisper that it carried the sound of distant drums, the heartbeat of a promise kept through time, and so, the bond between a humble farmer and a brave Apache girl became more than just a memory. It became a living story of hope, teaching that kindness needs no wealth, no power, and no reward. It only needs a heart that dares to care.